Okay. Well, all is done, but not yet said, I suppose. I explored both Days of Decision and World in Flames together. Now, I've played World in Flames a couple of times, usually opposed. This is the biggest solo game of it I played. I did Days of Decision as an exploration before I played the World in Flames game, along with a couple little introductory scenarios. I'm not going to talk too much about Days of Decision because I believe I discussed it pretty heavily in terms of as a standalone game. In terms of how it affects Days of Decision, it definitely, or how it affects World in Flames, it definitely allows you a great deal of flexibility, especially if you're playing with a wide open game or whatever, where you're allowed to change the alliances. But that three-sided game that Days of Decision provides has a particular impact on the whole flavor of the situation, which is probably, if you play to the full map and don't cheat or whatever, a Soviet-Allied alliance is going to defeat the Axis. So then the question becomes, okay, what are the dynamics within that in terms of I gotta check this because I can never tell. In terms of how your chances are within that. And the Soviets are at something of a disadvantage from what I can see, which is that the Allies can kind of say, screw you to Russia. Now, we saw some of the negative effects to that in my game, but I think that had I not been cheating quite so heavily again in favor of the Axis, accidentally, but who knows, that the screw you to Russia might still have worked. There are some means of getting around that. For example, Russia starting the Chinese Civil War was kind of a response to that kind of attitude in such a way that really kind of put the Allied feet to the fire. But in the long run, it hurt the Soviets more. Another alternative is that the Axis could try to form some sort of pact with the Soviets. The problem with that, of course, is the Soviets don't have a real escape route. With Japan to the east and Germany to the west, what are you going to give them? You can give them, you know, the Balkans or Poland or something, but then you're just making a mighty Russia that Germany can't really face. I could see some sort of alliance working in that kind of direction, but it would take a lot of convincing. Another option is to play with the wilder variants where people can leave their factions, and I sort of was doing that, but under restrictions that I didn't really cover terribly well, even in my own mind. Those can give you a completely chaotic setup. And would have very wild effects on victory potentially. Because you're not allowed to attack people in your faction. One thing I can tell you is that three-sided faction nature doesn't quite capture everything. So I mentioned this in one of the videos. If France, an ultra-nationalistic, almost fascist France were to exist, it probably still wouldn't be allied with Germany and or Italy, with Germany. That ideological breakdown, I think, ignores national interests, which should have been built in, and I don't think it's a good solution. So in some ways, I think Days of Decision kind of fails to really present that whole world view that would have been possible. Now, granted, allowing countries to change their ideology, etc., is just a very, optional, one of the more extreme optional rules in the game. So, not a lot of effort was put into it, but I think something interesting could allow you to explore those kind of opportunities, and I would be interested in trying to tweak play with Days of Decision to see if it could open up different opportunities, or on the other hand, you could just kind of make them rules by fiat. One of the problems with DoD that I saw in both cases was there are options that just don't get played. So there's a significant amount of rules overhead and component overhead in terms of the card, the player aid cards. They're not actually cut out to be cards. That use up, this physical component without giving much added play value. One of them I brought up was the Chinese Civil War, which I actually invoked, but other is India, giving them their freedom, creating a state out of Hawaii. But there were many of the sort of international options, I don't know what they're called, but they're sort of unaligned ones that nobody ever really did. People played with the Naval Treaty because political effectiveness is hit by that. People obviously played with aligning minors and stuff like that. But the credit card never got called in, and it's got restrictions that prevent it from being easily called upon. And a number of others, there's I think 20 of them. I maybe used 5, and the others just don't really work. What I'm more interested in, though, is World in Flames itself. I think that's, although I really enjoy the fact that Days of Decision gives you something that, quite honestly, no other World War II game gives you, that ability to explore it to even the depth that it does. And there's nothing else out there that lets you look at the diplomatic and economic tensions in the kind of light that it really gives to you. I'm looking right now at Gathering Storm for a World at War, and it's just nothing to compare with it. And the Totaler Krieg, the old random scenario generation, essentially. Again, it is not of the same scale. All right, for World in Flames, I should just work through the rule book. But the biggest thing in the rule book, first of all, component-wise, the newer editions, and that's more or less what I have, really, really beautiful. The artwork on the counters, for the planes especially, but the boats also are kind of pretty. But the planes really kind of give you this evocative picture of what's going on. Okay. So, one of the tricky things I had to deal with was initiative in World in Flames, which is a 2-player game. Days of Decision 3 and 2, for that matter, both had their own little patches to have it work. I came up with my own, and mine seemed to work pretty well. I don't feel like it was a huge skew in the game. The weather conditions for the game. I don't know how reasonable these are. Essentially, you face a D10's worth of fixed weather patterns that hit everywhere on the globe. it's more detail than most games will give on this. It gives you a breakdown of essentially 5 different types of weather, and they each have their own effects in different sections of the board. It's actually a pain in the butt to keep track of. You don't have any kind of components that help you with it. I used little paper hats or whatever, which I threw out because they were kind of crappy. I guess as an overview look at World in Flames, it is sort of the most detailed of these grand strategic World War II games that I've seen. The only one that might compare is ETO. Now it's Advanced ETO and Advanced PTO by Decision Games. And I haven't, I looked at the old ETO under TSR SPI auspices, and it didn't really impress me. The thing people were most excited about, I remember, was, ooh, name ships, you know, as compared to Third Reich. Well, World in Flames has that, you know. Beyond that, I'm not sure what other systems are in place in the game. So that's one of the few of these big World War II games that I know very little about. I just glanced at it, the original, and didn't see anything that I knew about. But comparing this to the Advanced Third Reich, a World at War situation, this is much, much more detailed, and way more detailed than Axis Empire's Total Krieg, certainly than Hitler's War, than Unconditional Surrender. This is the game that if you want to worry about military details and you don't want to go to the level of, say, Europa and try to figure out if navies work in Europa or something like that, this is probably your choice. If you want to focus on the purely military aspects of World War II, straight up World in Flames is your choice. If you want to go beyond that, World in Flames doesn't have a lot in the way of diplomacy. It doesn't have research. Well, it handles it, but in a different sort of way than some of the other games. So there's a lot of stuff kind of missing from it. Days of Decision adds the diplomacy factor to the game, and I think that's a big help, but you don't have much in the way of research. Research is going to be handled through your force pool, which grows each year, and you have the opportunity to toss out chits. And that's kind of all you have with research is I can get rid of chits, you know, I can winnow my force pool. So the actual impulse structure is kind of an interesting situation because it allows the game to split what are already fairly short-term turns compared to the other strategic games. They're 2-month turns into separate little impulses. So you have a lot of different opportunities to do things. And that means that, you know, unlike a 3-month turn or whatever that, say, Third Reich has, where you just sweep across the map all at once in it, here the attacks are sort of more segmented and detailed. You have to get your breakthrough, and then you have to push through, and it all kind of plays out in the time. In some ways, it makes it feel less like a World War II game, just because you're not seeing that broad sweep that you expect in a World War II game. But they happen. you can get the massive breakthroughs along the front. It's just the opponent has a chance to withdraw in the midst of that. So it's sometimes less decisive than you might be used to in the strategic World War II games. But also, I think that extra detail actually gives you a better view of what's going on. The one thing that really irks me about the game, and part of it's required, is the allowable activities. In each of your impulses, you have to choose what kind of impulse you want to have. Do you want to have a purely land impulse, a purely naval, a purely air, or these combined impulses? And I guess the problem that I have is if you do something somewhere, if I have a major land offensive in Russia, I can't at the same time be paying attention to naval activities. This actually reminds me a lot of the kind of dilemma you have in a CDG, where, okay, we're doing this, you know, you play a card, you do something. And it gives you that kind of limited activities that I think is very popular amongst players who want to be able to be faced with really hard choices. I find it painful because you have to keep specific counts of how many of each thing you're doing, and sometimes that's difficult, especially in the combined actions. If you're looking at two different maps to figure out, okay, what am I doing in the Pacific, what am I doing in Europe, and this is really a problem mainly for the Commonwealth, but to a limited extent, or a more limited extent to the U.S., and certainly, you know, if they're operating on both theaters pretty heavily, yeah, it will be for them. And then also, you know, even within a single map, it doesn't seem unreasonable that Germany would be pursuing their war against Russia. Oh yeah, I started this game during the Expo, or just before the Expo, so you know, I wanted to wear the shirt from this year. First year I got a shirt, actually. Every other year I registered too late or whatever. Couldn't make up my mind. Anyway, getting back. I feel like it imposes unnatural restrictions. I'm not quite sure what should be present. I almost feel like what you should have is, say, the effects of a combined move in addition to the major move. So like if you took a naval action, you would get the air actions from a combined move and the land actions from a combined move. If you take a land opportunity, you would have some chance to do a little bit of naval action. You could send the subs out or whatever. Unfortunately, these are also worked in with the offensive chit, which is a very expensive purchase, but it allows you to do a super combined action, among other different possibilities. But one of the best opportunities is to do the super combined option. And kind of the problem I have is that if you don't do the super combined action, it's very hard to get your ground offensives to actually work because of the timing between impulses. If I fire off my air activations and I soften up the opponent with ground strikes, then I'm not really capable of immediately taking advantage of them. If I do a combined operation, I can make one sector of the front move forward. If I just take a land operation, I probably can't do a hell of a lot better. The best thing I can perhaps do is hit an air operation on one impulse, and then on my next impulse, hope that my opponent hasn't sort of reorganized and recovered from that. And if he doesn't have headquarters, he won't. And then hit him with the land operation. One of the things is the ground strikes tend to be pretty ineffectual in any specific case. So if I only throw a couple of planes in against one location, I got no guarantees that I'm going to flip anything over and get the big advantage. Without the air operation, though, I pretty much have trouble moving forward at all, right? So unless I do a broad across the front air operation, and if I do that, I'm able to probably flip a fair amount of units. Now, if I could react immediately with the super combined offensive, then I can make hits everywhere. If I can't do that, it's really tough on, say, a pure ground offensive or a pure, a straight combined offensive to really get much movement on the front. Sometimes it feels like the fronts just didn't move enough. Maybe I'm not, you know, willing to bite the bullet and buy those offensive chits often enough. They require a lot of pre-planning. In fact, This game across the board requires a lot more pre-planning than I'm probably capable of. I can probably defend a lot better than I can handle an offensive operation. Another thing is the sequencing of operations. In particular, port attacks. You can't do those unless you set them up ahead of time, which means your enemy has a chance to run away from them, usually, if he's willing to commit the right kind of operation for that. You can't do invasions unless you do the combined operation, because you don't get land, ground, and naval movement at the same time, unless you do a naval move set up for the invasion and sit there with a big flag saying, "I'm invading," flying out there. I don't know if it's just my inability with naval operations, but I never really could get... The play that came out of the game didn't reflect reality for me, and it never has. What I've noticed in naval operations is you pretty much have to get your entire navy together against part of the opponent's navy, because that's where you get the big advantage. There are reasons not to do that. There's no question. You need to kind of... So what you end up with is this weird guessing game or waiting game, where one person doesn't want to commit their navy, the other person doesn't want to commit their navy, because whoever does it first is at some sort of disadvantage, because the other guy can then either overwhelm the portion of the navy that the first guy put out, or if he put everything out into one place, he can go everywhere else and, you know, handle cutting off his economic convoys that he needs to keep his production running. Let me switch battery out, and we'll keep things going. Probably need a little bit more of that to me. Okay. There were a lot of operations in the game that I didn't fully explore, things like carpet bombing, which really meant for the strategic bombers, but it's a way of knocking out the other guy's forces straight up. But again, probably like ground strikes, has to be kind of done in a pure air move to soften up the enemy before you actually make the attack, because otherwise you don't have enough air. Didn't do much air transport except just shifting things around. So the concept of units flipping, air units, naval units, they flip over once they've done something. Artillery as well. Artillery is kind of cool. That's one of the little patches. So the game's been put together as a patchwork. The old 5th edition, which I had, and everything before that kind of had, okay, here are, you know, here's Europe, here's Asia, here's the pieces you have, and here's the rules, and this is the core of the game. And then, starting with the 5th edition, I think, but it may have started earlier, they started expanding it. Scandinavia, Africa, the Western Hemisphere. And one of the big things with all the maps except Europe is they have a different movement scale. And that causes some serious issues. So what I was noticing over in Asia was the steppes in Russia were really easy to conquer in Europe, but the steppes in Asia were really hard to move through because the scale is different. Many less units can hold the line there. I know there's a WIF Master Edition that's supposed to fix all that by putting the whole world on the right scale. It's also an absolute fortune if it ever gets made, but it also, I think, is doing all the units on the divisional scale, which is one of the things. You have these different sized units. Now divisions are kind of cool because they give you a little extra oomph in a stack. So you have 3 stack. You have normally you can only stack 2 corps or army in a space. The divisions allow you a 3rd unit that you can put in there, just an extra sort of half stacking point. But they're also very useful on some of those little side maps like Africa or Scandinavia or something, where there aren't a lot of, really valuable things to capture, but you don't want to waste a whole corps kind of screening that area of the map, especially in some kind of nice terrain. A division can probably hold off whatever you're coping with. So anyway, the concept of these units flipping. Air and naval units flip over when you use them, for the most part. But not air unit rebases, but naval unit rebases do. And you're able to reorganize these units during your movement phase if you flip over a headquarters. It can then reorganize a small quantity of units. And that small quantity of units can kind of push your offensive a little further. That's really potent if you're somewhere like North Africa where you only have a few units fighting the battle. But it can also be decisive someplace like in Russia, where you can make that little extra push and just, threaten the whole enemy line with that. And that's what headquarters are there for. They're also there for supply. If you can't trace supply back to a city, and I kind of extended it to a rail line for the most part. If you can't trace supply back to a city, you end up, not all the time, some of the times, I only like to cheat a little bit. If you can't trace back to a city, you need something that can get you there, basically, something to bridge the gap, and the headquarters can do that. There's also supply depots, which I didn't use. They allow you to kind of to turn a headquarters into an ultimate supply source for the turn, I think, or maybe it's just the impulse. Generally, it seemed like you could keep supplies in most areas. If you're the defender, you have supplies usually because you can fall back on your cities. If you're the attacker, you do need the headquarters to push forward your advance, at least in some places, not everywhere. Oh, the naval rules. Naval rules are something I'm so horrible at, and I feel like I grasp the functioning of the rules. I feel like I was doing them correctly, at least towards the end, but trying to understand the how to best manipulate those rules, that's just beyond me. And if you look at the playthrough, you can see the play that I've got over in the Pacific does not look like it fits any naval strategy that makes sense in terms of, what it comes closest to? It comes closest to some of the pre-war plans. Yeah, there'll be this massive battleship battle. And we had a few of those. We had a lot of massive engagements. One of the problems there was the tactics that I took with the Japanese, or the strategy that I took with the Japanese, which may or may not be legal, in days of decision in the pre-war, by going after the Netherlands, East Indies, and by succeeding in China, which is partially Russia's fault, more than anything else probably, is that, and cheating as well, although I don't think the cheating mattered that much there, because the Chinese would have been stuck out of supply if they'd wanted to do anything. The amount of resources that Japan had allowed them to build up their whole navy, plus the extended time that the U.S. had. And that gets me to countermix. Countermix is a big factor in the game. You got the big old U.S. countermix, huge, the big old Commonwealth countermix, not far from it. Germans, Russians, these guys are getting kind of small. Japan is really getting much, much smaller. And that's a big deal, because even if Japan's doing very well, or Italy's doing really well, or France survives, they're not going to have the ability to put out either a big army, and in some cases that makes sense, there should be a limit to the size of the army, nor are they going to be able to put out that big a navy, even if they have the time to build it all. So what I had was some weird sort of gamey decisions on whether or not to, how to engage. So the Japanese were out of countermix. So they wanted to keep fighting attrition battles against the U.S., even though maybe the U.S. kind of, because of its higher production, could win the attrition war. The Japanese couldn't win the no fighting war, even if they held everything they had, because they wouldn't get any more ships to produce. Another gamey thing in it with the naval rules is this: okay, I'm going to wait until I think the turn's about to end and I'm going to do something. Because that way you don't have as much time to react, and maybe I get to do my something, do some damage to you, and boom, up, end of turn, sorry, I'm going home, you don't get to do any damage to my fleet. You don't see that in the land war, but the naval war generates that kind of weird situation. Like I said, there's no research in the game, except beyond culling your supply, your force pool. What that means is the Germans just get their rockets, for whatever value those are. The U.S. just gets an A-bomb in a certain period. They just get to buy it, It's available in their force pool. I had it available at the end of the game. I didn't buy it because I had no easy way to deliver it. Things like the Manhattan Project, the effort to get jets, radar, all these technological advances, to me, that's kind of a big part of World War II. And I know there's an expansion, a couple of expansions I don't have. Maybe Factories in Flames handles the research. And again, maybe Patton in Flames gives the Russians and the Germans, well, not the Germans, the Russians, a richer countermix than they have here. Because come 46, the U.S. gets piles and piles of stuff, and pretty much nobody else gets much. The Germans get some too, and the Russians, but not that much. There's also America in Flames, which may further expand that German force pool, and maybe the Japanese one as well, because I believe it's all the Axis coming in against the U.S., which you really can't fight out on that Western Hemisphere map very effectively, but you can certainly fight it out in the other. I didn't play with the intelligence option. The oil option is really huge. So if you don't play with the oil option, to me, that's about as big a difference to the game as not playing with the activities limits. If you just ignored activities limits and said, okay, do whatever you want, in a sense, the oil limitations are almost, to me, a way of making up for the activity limitations. Like, if you're playing with oil, you might be able to just say screw it to the activity limitations. Some countries are not that affected by it. Like the U.S. doesn't have unlimited oil, but it has a lot. And if it's allowed to stockpile it from 36 on in days of decision, it ends up, able to fight the war just on the strategic reserve. Same is true of Russia. No other country's in that position, though. Every other country is kind of able to put some oil away, but gets to the point where they're actually running into negative oil. In fact, the U.S. and Russia did too. The only thing is they were sitting on so much additional oil. And those oil concerns, because they're necessary to unflip airplanes, boats, and headquarters, and any mechanized units, including motorized infantry, just everything except your foot troops, basically, and your artillery, requires it. So you have this stockpile you have to deal with. Now, the one thing that would change it and make it more effective, from my point of view, basically you can trace oil supply anywhere you can trace supply. Whereas when you move oil units from across the board, the actual resources that you're expending for the supply are moved like other resources to the factories for the production. We'll talk about production in a bit. But what that means is they take convoys to ship to where you need them in the factories and to wherever you decide to hoard all your oil. But when units actually need them, nothing needs to bring them to them. And I think that if you required the oil to use up a portion of a convoy situation, like oil supplies. So if I trace to an oil center or to wherever the oil is sitting, you know, if I have to move a fifth of an oil and that takes up a fifth of a transport, okay, you know, I can just round that off and say that doesn't count. But if I have to, you know, if I have forces, I don't know, in the Pacific that need a significant amount of oil from the U.S., my activities should be limited by the shipment of that oil to Honolulu. Now, that may require that you need more convoys available or whatever, and they're already kind of a pain in the ass. But I would give a lot to get rid of the activity limits. And I think that the oil management is actually probably the best way to represent that. You might also want to represent it with something else, something like the offensive jets, like a command ability or whatever, because coordinating a huge offensive across the front is an effort. I just don't know if it's as expensive an effort as the 15-point. You know, I mean, that's huge. That's like, you know, laying down 8 battleships or something in a turn, or 8 carriers. It's just a huge cost, and it's really, really hard to convince yourself, oh yeah, I need that 15 points for one impulse. Not even a turn, one impulse you get it, that big bonus. Okay, production itself. So production in Days of Decision and World in Flames is actually pretty much the same. You have to gather up resources from the various places they are, bring it to your factories, and you produce the goods, and then you buy your force pool from them. Now, the two games don't quite mesh. Days of Decision lets you like build up your army all at once. World in Flames has this gearing limit, which reduces how much you can build at any given time of anything. And it also has this production circle, which says, okay, you know, it takes me a year to lay down a battleship, and then another year to get it floated. You know, so you really have to like pre-plan what forces you're going to need, purchase them in advance, etc. And so that the difference between those two is quite significant in terms of, you know, how you're going to react to how you put your forces on the board. With if you played Days of Decision leading into World in Flames, but without playing World in Flames in conjunction, you could slap down all your troops in 1939 and say, "Oh look, here I am." You know. One weirdness about the production system is if I have factories in India, all I have to do is bring the resources to the factory. They produce them. I don't have to worry about bringing the product back to Britain in order to build units in Britain. The units that I build are drawn at random, so I don't really have control. If I say I want an infantry and there's Australian infantry in the pool, maybe I build an Australian, even though it's absolutely vital for me to build troops, you know, to defend Britain. Much less of a big deal for Germany, although they end up getting their minor allies kind of mixed in with their regular troops in that way. So that's kind of weird. Victory. Vichy rules are... The Vichy rules from Days of Decision, when applied, just leave a mess. But anyway, victory in the game. I don't think this is a balanced game. We saw in my play what I'm going to call an Axis victory. I don't know how long it would take for them to finally get the victory level that they need, which is control of everything on both maps, both the prime maps. I'm not sure it's even possible, but with the amount of cheating that I did, I came damn close to it. And then with Russia changing sides and becoming not Axis, but aligning itself with the Axis enough that it was going to war with Britain. To grab India. It just looked like it was going to be hellish to try to take every location on the two maps. In fact, the invasion of Britain, with the huge navies that were present for Britain in the North Atlantic, looked like it was going to happen eventually, but I was in 45, and it probably would have taken a couple of years to get a sea line off, just because I had to keep starving Britain and keep hammering whatever ships they had, and put it so that they couldn't defend themselves. And now here, there was the possibility that the U.S. would defeat Japan in the meantime, and then be able to turn against Germany. It was not, I don't think it was a winnable situation for the Allies, just because their production was outstripped and Britain was being starved, and I just couldn't keep going. But it's a really, really tough position to try to win as the Axis. But what's really nice about it is it doesn't make that gamey type answer that most of the other World War II games make. Most of them they follow Third Reich in this. Yeah, if the Axis can survive until X date, they get a minor victory if they can survive a little longer. You know, if you do better than you did historically. Now, here your goal is what your goal is. You're Germany, you want Europe. You know, you're Japan, you got to count on Germany to take enough heat off of that you can survive and hold off the Americans until finally, you know, whatever. Between you and Germany, you can take them down, or whatever. Because Japan can't do it on their own, you know. And Japan knew that. You're Italy, you got to kiss up to your ally and see what you can take. Individual victory conditions, man. You got to work together as a team, and you got to try to win as whatever alliance faction you're in. In the three-sided game, though, it does really kind of throw some additional tension between Russia and the Western Allies. At least the way I played it, it threw probably too much tension in. But yeah, there's something very refreshing about looking at a game and trying to achieve what the actual players in reality were trying to achieve. It is very discouraging to me to see a World War II game where my goal is, you know, to just survive a little longer with Germany. Somebody brought forth that, yeah, you get, you know, you get a simulation of the actions by putting kind of a high watermark. And I know that Total or Krieg, Unconditional Surrender, some of the more modern designs do this, where they put a requirement that you had to do this. You had to succeed in something. And last longer. I still think it taints play. So like Unconditional Surrender, you have to defeat either France or Russia, I believe. Or maybe it's Britain or Russia. And then survive to a certain point. I don't remember which it is. But it definitely, you know, pushes your bar to a point that is not trivial to reach. You can't just sit there and you know, I mean, in this game, with the with we didn't go into American entry, so yeah, I didn't like how American entry worked with Days of Decision built in. American entry is just this calculation, and I use the chits from World in Flames. So basically, you have these chits that you get a chance to draw with every action that's taken by everyone. So, you know, if allies are declaring war on things, you lose chits for that in the base World in Flames. In Days of Decision, instead, you get chits against everyone. And if someone's, you know, if you have chits against Britain, they count against your ability to enter the war against someone else because they're your same alignment. But if the alignments are allowed to shake up, which they are in Days of Decision under certain conditions, this allows you to not, you know, bake in a fixed type of situation the way World in Flames does, where you're only worried about the allies versus the Axis or whatever. So that all, you know, it works. It keeps hidden from the players just how ready the opponent is. But the problem is it's American readiness that's always hidden. I don't know. Also, whenever you declare war on X in World in Flames, you immediately get a surprise attack, and that gives you certain advantages that are not insignificant. You know, sufficient to cause a Pearl Harbor if you can do that. But yeah, you know, between the two, World in Flames gives you this, I think, the most detailed of the military games. And it's no sillier than any of the others, I don't think. I think it stays on the rails pretty well on its own. Days of Decision, you're in the, okay, you can get to some serious what if here, especially if you play with some of the options. But it gives you, I think, probably the strongest prelude to the war that you can possibly get. One of the nice things that the game does also, like Axis Empires, is it starts at a time when you can actually begin the invasion of China. I'm kind of discouraged by World War II games that start in '39 with the invasion of Poland. Screw that, man. Let me at least make that decision. Do I want to go into China? Because that is the key decision in the Pacific. The Japanese, if they don't go into China, have other opportunities available to them that are of interest. I don't think that they necessarily work out well, but I liked the opportunity to go after the Netherlands East Indies first. Get that oil. That's going to be my limiting factor for so many things. And then, you know, by doing that, I opened up the opportunity for the Russians to start a civil war in China, for the Chinese themselves to make things easier, which almost never would happen in a game where Japan declares war on China in '37. So anyway, it's really great to be able to look at different opportunities. I'm not sure I really believe the Days of Decision diplomatic model, but it's neat. It's got some little gamey factors in it, so that it's not just this purely deterministic system. I remember the old DoD was much more deterministic. This one, whoever triggers a given miner has a lot of power over just which direction it goes in some cases. You can't overwhelm, you know, some countries are just, combined with some actions, are just going to be in a certain position. I did have some problems, though, with the idea of civil wars. If your side won a civil war, that doesn't change the international relationship. So, for example, Germany won a civil war, supported and won a civil war in Poland, but the Poles still don't trust Germany with a damn. And I was kind of hoping to get Poland as an ally, as opposed to putting them, as a speed bump to Russia. And they ended up being kind of this giant breakwater that I had to stream around in both directions, which was just weird as hell. I think Axis Empires allows you to align Poland as the Germans. And frankly, I think had Germany made the right diplomatic overtures, Poland could easily have gone pro-German in the sense of being anti-Russian. They fought a war with Russia before. Now, what has to be offered is the question. There's Russian territory that Poland felt was theirs, Anyway. Is it enjoyable? It's too much to solo. I mean, it was really pushing my limits, especially since this is the first time that I've dealt with it on any big scale, and especially taking days of decision at the same time. I think if I soloed it a few more times, I would feel pretty comfortable with it, though, and maybe even start to get, a grip on the naval rules and not screw up as much. Maybe start to come up with some modifications to the things that I don't really feel as comfortable with. And I think the game can suffer a lot of tweaking, and it can suffer a fair amount of cheating without totally breaking. I mean, look, okay, Russia collapsed. That's not that unreasonable an outcome, to tell you the truth. One thing I don't like about it is countries don't just surrender. Now, there's diplomatic imperative or incentive to surrender in the days of decision situation. But pure world in flames, Russia, Britain, Germany, Japan, they all fight to the last drop of blood. Italy has, I believe, some surrender rules baked in. France obviously does. But yeah, there's no national will element, and I kind of miss that kind of situation. Next game that I'll do of this type, A World at War, which is the Advanced Third Reich derivative, is more to my tastes in terms of that. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's more to my tastes. But one thing that's really nice about World in Flames in comparison to that one is it has a cohesive set of systems. So the naval rules work the same everywhere. They do now in World at War, but there aren't a whole hell of a lot of special cases. Do you want to touch on the rulebook for World in Flames? This pieced together final edition rulebook that includes all the expansions, but or all the optional rules kind of as little gray boxes and stuff. That's not the easiest way to absorb a game, and it's kind of a pity. I'm not sure what would work better. But I did find that kind of difficult. But you kind of have to play a game this size to learn anything about it, and there are parts that I don't feel like I still grasp, but I could probably capture them in another playing fairly soon, as long as I don't let it go, 15 years again or whatever. Anyway, it has a definite place in anybody's collection, just because there is nothing else that does what it does, I don't think. And it does it well enough.